The morning Silas Rourke rode up to Briar Hollow and actually threw his head back and laughed at the willow windbreak. Maren had spent 3 weeks building with her own bleeding hands. She didn't say a word. She just stood there in the November cold, mud on her boots, rope burns still raw on her palms, and watched a man twice her age treat 5 months of survival like it was a joke. "Girl," he said, loud enough for the 2 ranch hands riding with him to hear, "you'd do better hanging laundry than building fences." His men snickered. Rhett took 1 step forward. Maren put her hand on his arm and stopped him. Not because Silas was right, but because Montana winters have a way of settling arguments that no human voice ever could. And that storm was already coming. If this story moves you, stay with us until the end. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. The last thing Maren Whitlock's father ever told her was to trust her ears in a storm. She'd been maybe 12 years old, standing at the kitchen window watching a January whiteout swallow the fence posts, one by one until the whole world was nothing but white and howling sound. Her father, Daniel Whitlock, had come up behind her with a cup of coffee in each hand. He always made 2, even when she was too young for it, and he'd pressed one into her fingers and said, "Listen. When the wind shifts east, something out there needs help. West means it's just showing off." She hadn't understood it then. She'd thought it was the kind of thing, fathers said to fill silence. The kind of wisdom that sounds important and means nothing. She understood it on the night of November 14th, 1881. The wind had been screaming west all evening, showing off. Her father would have said, but sometime around 10 o'clock it changed. She felt it before she heard it. The cabin groaned differently. The gaps around the window frame whistled at a different pitch. And then there was something beneath the storm's voice, something that didn't belong to the weather at all. A horse, not moving, not running from the cold, which was what you expected. Just screaming in place, the way animals scream when they can't leave what they're standing beside. Maren sat up in the dark and stayed still for 30 seconds, telling herself it was her imagination, telling herself she was exhausted and hearing things, telling herself that her father had only been dead for 4 months, and grief did strange work on the sleeping mind. Then the horse screamed again, and she was already pulling on her boots. She didn't stop to think about it the way she probably should have. She didn't calculate her firewood supply, didn't consider what condition she'd be in tomorrow morning if she spent the next 2 hours fighting a Montana blizzard in the dark. She just layered wool over cotton, oilskin over wool. Gloves inside her coat sleeves grabbed the rope she kept coiled on the hook by the door, went out. The cold hit her like a physical thing, not a temperature but a force, something with weight and intention. In a proper blizzard, the snow doesn't fall so much as it moves horizontally, driven so hard it stings exposed skin like gravel. Maren pulled her scarf up over her nose and moved toward the fence line by memory because her lantern was useless in that wind. She nearly turned back twice. The first time was when she stepped into a drift that came up to her hip and had to fight her way out on her hands and knees, spitting ice. The second time was when she realized she'd drifted slightly north and wasn't entirely sure which direction the fence was anymore. Both times something kept her going, not bravery, not stubbornness, something more animal than either. The horse was still screaming. Whatever made it stay in one place in a storm like this was not something a healthy animal would do. Something was wrong enough that leaving felt impossible. She found the fence by running her shin into it. The pain was sharp and immediate, and she grabbed the top rail and held on, getting her bearings. Then she heard the horse maybe 30 feet to her left, and she moved along the fence toward it, hand over hand, until the shape of a horse emerged from the white, a dark gray animal, big, standing with its legs braced and its head low, doing everything in its power not to run. Maren reached for its bridle. The horse shied hard but didn't bolt. She grabbed the cheek piece and held on, talking into the storm, not words exactly, just sound. just the tone her father had used with frightened animals, low and even and unhurried. The horse trembled under her grip but stayed. Then she saw what was in the saddle. A man. He was slumped forward so badly that his chest was nearly on the horse's neck. One hand still clutched the saddle horn, the grip of someone who has been unconscious for a while, but whose body hadn't yet let go. His right leg hung at an angle that made Maren's stomach tighten. The boot had been improvised. Someone had wrapped the lower leg in cloth and leather. Field work. Rough work. The kind of wrapping you do when you're trying not to bleed to death and still have miles to cover. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathe. Just barely. Hey! She pushed his shoulder and he didn't respond. She pushed harder. Hey, I need you to wake up. I can't carry you. Nothing. The horse shifted under her. The man's weight shifted with it. He was going to fall. And if he fell here, she was going to lose him in the snow. And she was absolutely not going to let that happen. She didn't even know why she felt so certain about it. She'd never seen this man before in her life. She wedged herself between the horse and the fence and used the fence rail as a brace, and she put both hands on the man's arm and pulled, and what happened next was not graceful or efficient. He came sideways out of the saddle, and for one terrible moment his whole weight was on her, and her knees buckled, and they both went down. She caught herself on the fence. He hit the snow, and the impact seemed to wake him enough to groan. "Good," she said. "Stay awake. Can you hear me?" "Yeah." His voice was barely there. "Yeah, I hear you. What's your name?" A pause long enough that she thought he'd passed out again. Rhett, I'm Maren Whitlock. My ranch is about 40 feet that direction." She pointed, then realized he couldn't see her pointing. "Can you get up if I help you?" Another long pause. "I'll try." He tried. It took her 7 minutes to get him upright, she counted, not for any useful reason, just because her mind needed something to hold on to, and another 4 to get him through the gate and across the yard and through the cabin door. He couldn't put weight on his right leg at all, and he was heavy, and twice he went down in the snow, and she had to haul him back up with arms that were already shaking from the cold. She kept talking the whole time, not to comfort him, not really to keep herself focused, because if she stopped talking, she might stop moving. "Almost there. Don't stop. Keep moving. I've got you." Almost there, she'd heard those words before in her own voice. She'd said them to the weakened calf she'd coaxed through a bad march when she was 16. She'd said them to herself, walking in from the south field the night she'd found her father slumped against the fence post with his heart already stopped. Words you say not because they help, but because silence is worse. She got him through the door. She got him to the floor in front of the stove because the bed was in the next room, and she didn't have the strength to get him there. She went back out for the horse, because you don't leave an animal in a blizzard if you have a choice, and she had a choice, even if it was a barely a choice kind of choice. She got the horse into the barn and stripped the tack and put a blanket over the animal and put out water and feed, and the whole time her hands were so numb she couldn't feel the buckles. She did it by memory and by the shape of things she couldn't feel. By the time she got back inside, the man Rhett had pulled himself into a sitting position and was staring at the stove like he wanted to get closer to it but didn't have the remaining energy. She looked at him properly for the first time in the firelight. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark hair, thick with ice now, and matting against his forehead. Several days of stubble, a face that had been out in weather for most of its life, the kind of tan that doesn't fully leave in winter. The right leg of his trousers was dark with old blood from the knee down. His left shoulder sat wrong, not dislocated, but something in that vicinity, something pulled or torn. He'd been riding in that condition through a blizzard, which either made him extraordinarily determined or extraordinarily foolish. Possibly both. "How long were you out there?" she asked. "Since mid-afternoon." He tried to shift and went pale. "Thought I could make Harlan's place before the storm hit full." "You were wrong, yeah." A short, humorless sound. "I was wrong." She pulled off her outer layers and went to the kitchen and put water on. Not because she had a clear plan yet, but because hot water was the beginning of most solutions out here. While it heated, she got her medical kit, a tin box her father had kept stocked, though she'd had to replace some things over the summer. Clean cloth carbolic solution, the needle and gut for sutures if it came to that. She brought the lantern over and crouched beside Rhett and looked at his leg without touching it yet. "Can you straighten it somewhat?" He did slowly with his jaw clenched. "What happened?" "Barbed wire. Down near the creek crossing." He said it the way men say painful things, quickly and matter-of-factly, as if speed makes the words weigh less. "Fence was down. Rode into it in low visibility. It took me some time to get clear." The wound, when she got the wrapping off, was a series of parallel lacerations from mid-calf to just below the knee, deep in places. Not cleanly done wire doesn't make clean wounds, but none of them were still bleeding heavily, which was better than she'd feared. The cold had been brutal, but in this particular case, it had probably slowed the bleeding enough to keep him alive on horseback. She cleaned it without asking permission and without apologizing for the pain. He didn't ask her to stop and didn't make much sound. He gripped the edge of a floorboard with his left hand, hard enough that his knuckles went white, but that was all. "You got anyone expecting you?" she asked, working. "Business associate in Harlan. He'll figure it out when I don't show." "How soon?" "Tomorrow, probably. Roads won't be passable for at least 3 days." "Maybe more." She looked up at him. "You understand that?" He looked at the frosted window. She could see him calculating something: obligations, schedules, a life she knew nothing about. Then he looked back at her. "I understand that," he said. She wrapped the leg properly and turned her attention to the shoulder. He winced when she touched it and said, with some feeling, a word she pretended not to hear. She probed it carefully and determined it wasn't dislocated, just badly strained, something pulled and inflamed, the kind of injury that would heal with rest but could worsen significantly without it. "You need to not use this arm. I know what you need." "I'm telling you what's going to happen." She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. "You've lost blood. You're cold through to the center of you. Your leg needs to be kept clean and still for at least a week, or it's going to become a problem I don't know how to solve out here. And that shoulder is going to stiffen up so badly by morning you won't be able to lift a coffee cup." She paused. "Do you want my opinion of your situation, or do you want to pretend you've got choices right now?" Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it exactly. Surprise, maybe. "Or recalibration." "Your opinion," he said. "You stay until the road's open. You do what I tell you. You don't argue about it." She stood up. "That's the deal." He was quiet for a moment. "Then what do I owe you?" "Nothing. You can't pay me in a blizzard." She went to get the blanket from the chest. "Don't worry about it tonight. I don't like owing people." She paused with her back to him. "Neither do I," she said. "We have that in common." She built up the stove and made him drink broth she'd had simmering. Since yesterday, she kept a pot going most of the winter, adding to it when she had something to add, and he drank it without complaint. Told her he was more depleted than he was letting on. Exhausted men don't complain about food. Only men with energy left complain about food. She got him settled with the blanket and a heated stone wrapped in cloth tucked against his good side, and she went and sat in her father's chair across the room and watched him until she was sure his breathing had steadied. The storm beat against the cabin like it was trying to get inside. She sat in the chair with her knees pulled up and her cold hands tucked under her arms, and she looked at this stranger on her floor and thought about the last 4 months. About the silence that had grown in this cabin since August. About the way she'd started talking to herself sometimes. Not sentences, just single words: water, fence, fire. Mourning just to hear a human voice in a room that had been empty of them for too long. She hadn't cried since the funeral. There'd been too much to do. There was always too much to do, but sitting in the dark with the wind screaming outside and a stranger breathing slowly on her floor, she felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't name and didn't try to. She just let it move through her and settle somewhere lower, somewhere she could carry it without it showing. After a while, she checked his forehead for fever. He was warm but not alarming. She adjusted the heated stone. His eyes opened for a moment, unfocused. "Sleep," she said. He slept. She sat in her father's chair until the stove needed feeding, and then sat back down until it needed feeding again. She didn't sleep. She hadn't slept a full night since August, and tonight wasn't going to be different. She sat and she listened to the storm, and she listened to this stranger breathe. And for the first time in 4 months, the silence in the cabin was something other than unbearable. It was, in some way she couldn't explain, inhabited. The wind shifted somewhere around 3 in the morning. She heard it. Change felt it in the gaps around the window, a slight yielding in the sound. West, she thought, just showing off now. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stayed in her father's chair. Outside, the blizzard raged on. Inside, a stranger slept on her floor. And Maren Whitlock, who had not asked for any of this, who had lost too much already and had too much still to lose, sat alone in the dark and let the night pass over her. She had made the harder choice. She didn't know yet what it would cost her. She didn't know yet what it would give her back. But the second cup of coffee on the table, the one her father had always pressed into her hands, was, for the first time in months, not entirely a memory. It was a possibility. She sat with that thought for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the frosted glass, the willow trees her father had planted along the east fence line bent under the storm's full weight and held. He was running a fever by morning. Maren knew it before she even crossed the room. She could see it in the way he was sleeping, too still in some places and too restless in others, his head turning slightly against the folded blanket she'd put under it, his breathing shallow in a way it hadn't been at 3 in the morning. She put the back of her hand against his forehead and felt the heat radiating up at her and said quietly, to no one well, "There it is." She'd been half expecting it. You don't ride through a barbed wire fence in a blizzard and come out the other side without your body eventually sending a bill. The wound on his leg had looked clean the night before, as clean as she could make it with what she had, but infection didn't always announce itself right away. Sometimes it waited until you thought you were past it. She built the stove up higher and put more water on and went to check the leg. He woke up while she was unwrapping it, which startled her more than it startled him. Thought he was fully under. "How bad?" he said. His voice had the texture of gravel. "Ask me again in 10 minutes. She didn't look up from the bandaging. The wound wasn't angry yet, no red streaking outward, no swelling beyond what was reasonable, but it was hot to the touch in a way she didn't love. She cleaned it again, more carefully this time, and put fresh cloth on it and tried to be methodical about it rather than worried, because worry didn't help anything. "You don't sugarcoat things," Rhett said. "No, I appreciate that." She sat back and looked at him. In the morning light, he looked worse than he had the night before, which was expected but not encouraging. The fever had put color high in his cheeks but washed it from everywhere else. He looked like a man who had been running on will alone for longer than was wise, and had finally been forced to stop. "Do you have a name? A full name?" she asked. "Rhett Calloway." "Where are you from, Rhett Calloway?" "Originally? Wyoming." He shifted, tried to push himself up to sitting, and she put a hand on his good shoulder and stopped him. He looked at her hand, then at her face, then seemed to decide that arguing was more effort than he had. "Where are you headed?" "Horsebreaking work up near Harlan." "I've got a man waiting on 6 horses." He said it with the particular frustration of someone who hates letting other people down. Not an arrogant frustration, not "I have important things to do," but a practical one. "Someone is depending on me and I'm lying on a stranger's floor." "The horses will wait," she said. "The man might not. Then he'll find someone else." She stood up. "You have a fever. You're not going anywhere today." "I wasn't suggesting today." "Good." She went to the kitchen. "I'm going to make you something to eat." "Whether you want it or not." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you always this bossy with strangers?" "Only the ones who show up half dead on my fence line." There was a pause, and then he made a sound she hadn't expected. Not quite a laugh, more like the shape of one, the sound a laugh makes when the body producing it is too tired to commit fully. But it was something. It was the first genuinely human sound that had been made in this cabin in 4 months, and it landed in the room like something physical. Maren turned back to the stove and kept her face still. She made him broth again, and this time added some of the dried venison she'd been rationing carefully and a handful of the potatoes that were still holding in the root cellar. Nothing fancy. There was nothing fancy out here, but it was hot and it was real food, and he ate all of it without a word of complaint, which she took as a good sign. The storm was still going outside, though it had lost some of its fury in the night. Not over, not even close to over, but the screaming horizontal quality of it had shifted to something more resigned, a heavy, steady fall rather than an assault. Through the window, the world was white and featureless, the fence posts buried past their second rails. She'd need to dig out the barn path as soon as the wind dropped enough to make it worthwhile. "Your place?" Rhett asked, watching her look at the window. "My father's ranch. Mine now." She said it the way you say things that are still adjusting to being true. "He died in August." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She said it quickly, the way you say it when you want to close the door on something before it can swing all the way open. He seemed to understand that because he didn't push it. He just looked at the window for a moment and then looked back at his empty bowl. "How big is the operation?" he asked. 38 cattle. 2 horses. Some chickens that are mostly theoretical at this point. She glanced at him. "The chickens stopped laying in October, and I've been too optimistic about their recovery." "Foxes? Probably. You need a better coop." "I know what I need," she said, and there was more edge in it than she intended. And she heard it after it was out and didn't apologize, because apologizing would make it worse. She just moved on. "The coop is on the list. There's a long list." He didn't react to the edge. He just nodded slightly, like a man filing information, and let the conversation find its own pace. The fever broke on the second day, not dramatically. Not the way fevers break in stories, with the sudden drenching sweat and eyes flying open and the person sitting straight up. It just eased. She checked him at midday, and he was cooler than he'd been at breakfast. And by the time she came in from her afternoon barn run, his color had evened out, and he was lying on his back with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling with an expression of someone who had been in bed long enough to start thinking. "How's my horse?" he asked when she came through the door. "Fine. Better than you, honestly. She ate everything I gave her and wanted more. She's good stock." A pause. "Her name's Calliope." "That's a complicated name for a horse. She's a complicated horse." He turned his head to look at Maren. "She doesn't trust people easily. She trusted me. I noticed you came back from the barn without any new injuries. So yes." Something in his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same territory. "She doesn't let most people touch her." Maren pulled off her outer coat and hung it by the door and didn't say anything to that, because she didn't know what to say to it. On the third day, he was well enough to be irritating. He couldn't stand without help and couldn't put weight on the leg yet, but his mind was fully operational, and he had apparently decided to use it comprehensively. He noticed things. He noticed the way she braced the door against the draft with a rolled rug that needed replacing. He noticed the slight bow in the wall near the window that suggested something settling in the foundation. He noticed, when she came in from the barn the third morning with frost on her eyebrows and her jaw set in the particular way it got, when something hadn't gone right, that there was a problem before she said a word. What happened? The water trough in the barn froze despite the insulation. She hung her scarf. "I broke it up, but the pipe that feeds it is at risk. I need to wrap it better. What are you using, canvas and straw?" "You need something with more density. Old wool if you have it." He pushed himself carefully to a sitting position. She noticed he'd figured out how to do that without using the bad shoulder. "Is the pipe running through an exterior wall?" "Part of it." "That's the problem. The cold is wicking through the wall material. Canvas and straw won't hold against sustained below zero temperatures." He thought for a moment. Do you have any of that tar paper left over from roofing work? She looked at him. How do you know there's been roofing work? The pile of scraps under the overhang on the east side. Visible from the window. He said it without apology. I've been looking out the window a lot. She had tar paper. She hadn't thought to use it that way. She did it that afternoon, and the pipe held through the rest of the storm, which lasted another day and a half before finally running out of breath. When the wind finally died, she stood outside in the sudden quiet and listened to the silence. It was the specific silence that comes after a Montana blizzard, total and almost aggressive, like the land was compensating for 3 days of noise. The sky was white-gray and still. The snow was chest-deep in the drifts, but only knee-deep in the open areas. The fence posts had become suggestions. The willow trees along the east fence were buried to their lowest branches. She had cattle to check, snow to dig, a water system to assess, and a recovering stranger in her house. She started with the cattle. All 38 were alive, which was not something she'd been certain of an hour ago. 3 were weaker than she liked, huddled together in the back corner of the barn where the body heat accumulated. She made note of them and put extra feed in front of them and moved on because there was too much to do to spend more than necessary time on worry. Rhett was sitting up fully when she came back in, which was already more than she'd expected. He'd managed to move from the floor to the chair by the window, her father's chair, which she registered and then decided not to think about, and he had a look on his face that she'd been watching develop over 3 days. It was the look of a man who had been still for longer than he knew how to manage. All accounted for, he asked. All alive. 3 are weak. She sat down and pulled off her outer boots. Her feet were numb, and the process of getting feeling back in them was something she'd learned to just endure. Worst of the storm is done. Roads should open in a day or 2. Probably 2. She looked up at him. Your associate in Harlan, do you need to get a message out? Eventually. There's no way to reach him until the roads open anyway. He looked back out the window. The light was already going, even though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. I'll ride out the day after the roads are passable. She nodded. She'd known that was the plan. There had never been any other plan. She didn't know why the nod felt like it required slightly more effort than it should. Fed them both and sat across the room and mended a pair of work gloves that had been waiting on the mending pile since October and didn't say much, and neither did he. And the silence between them had changed from the silence of the first night, 2 strangers in proximity, into something easier to sit inside. He left on the 5th day, which was earlier than she would have recommended, and which she told him clearly. Your leg needs another week before you put that kind of pressure on it. I know, you're going to open those cuts again. Probably. If they get infected out there on the road without proper treatments. Maren, he said her name like that, just flat and clear, not unkindly. I know, I'm going anyway. She looked at him. He looked back. There wasn't an argument in his eyes, just a fact. He had a life out there that was waiting for him. And whatever had happened inside her cabin in the last 5 days, it was separate from that life, and they both knew it. She didn't fight it. She helped him saddle Calliope, which the horse tolerated, with what seemed like resigned awareness that her opinion wasn't being solicited. Rhett got up into the saddle with less grace than he probably preferred and more pain than he showed, and Maren could see both those things clearly and chose not to name either of them. What do I owe you? He asked again. The same question as the first night. Nothing, she said again. Same answer as before. You don't like owing people. I know. You're not owing me. I'm telling you that. She squinted up at him against the flat winter light. If you want to repay something, stay alive. Don't let that leg turn bad on the road. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a small gesture, minimal. The kind a man makes when words aren't quite what's needed, and he turned Calliope south and rode out through the gate and down the road toward Harlan. And in 3 minutes, the white landscape had swallowed him, and he was gone. She stood at the gate for longer than she should have, because it was cold and she had work to do. Then she went inside. The cabin was the same as it had been 5 days ago. Same walls, same stove, same table, same silence. Except the blanket she'd given him was folded on the floor where he'd been sleeping. He'd folded it before he left. It was such a small thing, and she didn't know why she noticed it as strongly as she did. She picked it up and put it in the chest and went to deal with the cattle. The winter that followed was the hardest of her adult life, and she had not had easy winters. December came in mean and stayed mean. The cold was not the dramatic blizzard cold of November. It was the sustained, grinding cold that didn't make dramatic gestures, but simply refused to leave. The kind of cold that kills things slowly. The kind that requires constant vigilance, not because of crisis, but because of accumulation. The small failures that stack up until suddenly something is irretrievable. The weak calf she'd flagged in November got weaker in December. She moved it into the cabin for 3 days, which was not something she would have admitted to anyone in the territory, because it would have read as sentiment, but was purely practical. The barn wasn't holding temperature adequately in the northeast corner, and she didn't have the materials to fix it midwinter. The calf slept near the stove and was offended by almost everything she did, and was alive by Christmas, at which point she moved it back to the barn and reinforced the corner with the last of the spare lumber. She kept the barn brace from going in January by noticing the right upright had shifted and wedging it back with what she had, which was not the right tool for the job, but was the tool she had. She rationed the winter feed by calculating forward not what she had, but how many days she needed to cover divided. With a margin for weather, and the margin she left was smaller than comfortable but larger than 0, and it turned out to be exactly right. She didn't see another person for 31 days in January. She didn't mean to count. She just noticed one afternoon that she hadn't spoken aloud in long enough that her voice sounded strange to her. When she finally had reason to use it, she was reading labels on jars in the root cellar and read one out loud without thinking, and then stood there in the dark cold of the cellar listening to herself. She started talking to the cattle after that. Not constantly, and not words that meant anything, just the low-running commentary her father had used. There you go. Easy. That's enough. Come on now, the sound of a human voice giving shape to a silent day. The bitterest week of February, she almost lost the water conduit entirely. The pipe she'd wrapped with tar paper held, but the connector joint at the barn end froze and cracked. And she spent 6 hours in the cold fixing it with materials she wasn't sure were adequate, while her fingers went from painful to numb to something past numb that she tried not to think about too hard. She got it fixed, it held. She came inside and sat in her father's chair and looked at her hands for a long time. She thought about the tar paper suggestion and the man who'd made it from a window. She thought briefly about what it would be like to have a second person to hand her the tools. Then she stopped thinking about it, because that was a path that led nowhere useful. March arrived with the particular cruelty of false springs, a week of softening that made you think it was over, then a hard freeze that turned the melt to ice and made everything twice as treacherous as the original snow. She fell once on the ice in front of the barn, hard enough to bruise the heel of her hand, and she sat in the mud and ice for a moment before getting up. Not because she was badly hurt, but because she was tired in a way that went past the body. She got up. She always got up. April came gray and slow and real. The ice began going from the creek in stages. First at the edges, then in the middle, and the sound of running water after months of silence was something she'd forgotten how much she needed until she heard it again. The cattle moved differently when the cold broke looser, ranging, remembering that they had options. The chickens, which she had almost entirely written off, resumed laying, which felt like a small negotiated peace. She was mending the south fence line one afternoon in late April, a section that had buckled under the weight of accumulated snow, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She didn't look up immediately. Hoofbeats on the road in April were not unusual. Ranchers moving stock, travelers who'd waited out the winter in Harlan, supply wagons starting their runs again. She kept working the fence wire, her pliers turning methodically until the hoofbeats turned in at her gate. Then she looked up. The horse was a dark gray mare with a white marking on her left shoulder, an unusual marking, the kind you notice once and remember clearly. She had seen that horse before. She had unsaddled that horse in a blizzard in November and put a blanket over her and given her water she couldn't feel her fingers to pour. Calliope. Rhett Calloway stepped down from the saddle with the ease of a man whose leg had healed properly, which was the first thing she checked. She noticed herself doing it and felt something between relief and embarrassment at her own transparency. He was leading a second horse, a sturdy brown mare she didn't recognize, and behind the horses there was a flat wagon being pulled by a single draft animal. Loaded with tools and lumber, and what appeared to be several bags of oats and a coil of heavy wire, stood at the fence line with her pliers in her hand and looked at him. He looked at her. "Your barn brace," he said. "What about it?" "I saw it when you were showing me out to the stable." Before I left, he tied Calliope to the her fence post, without asking if that was all right. It's not going to hold another winter without proper repair. She watched him do this. I know that. And the water conduit needs to be rebuilt from the connector joint. The repair you did in February. He stopped, looked at her. You had a hard February. How would you know that? Because that's the kind of winter it was, and you were doing it alone. He said it without drama. Just plainly. I was doing a job in Harlan through January and part of February, and the nights were cold enough that I thought about that conduit more than once. She was quiet for a moment. The April wind moved through the field around them, and the creek was audible in the distance, and the late afternoon light was making the wet grass look like it had its own light source from underneath. "You came back to fix my barn," she said. "I came back to offer a fair exchange." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper, which he held out to her. "Work for room and board. Standard terms. I've got the skills, you've got the space, and this place has enough wrong with it to keep me busy until fall." She didn't take the paper yet. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because I left owing you. I told you. I know what you told me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean into it. "I'm not talking about what I owe you for 5 days of soup and clean bandages. I'm talking about the fact that you went out in a blizzard in the dark and got me off a horse when you had every reason not to." He paused. "There's no standard accounting for that, but there's something like it, and this is the closest I can get." She looked at the loaded wagon. The lumber was good quality, better than what she'd been working with. The tools were real tools, not jury-rigged solutions. The oats were one of the things she'd been short on since February. She looked at him. He wasn't performing this. That was what she kept coming back to. He was just standing there in the April mud with his hat in his hands and his horse tied to her fence post, saying what he'd come to say, and waiting. She unfolded the paper and looked at the terms. They were exactly as stated. Fair. Actually fair. Not the kind of fair that has a catch buried in it, but the kind that looks fair when you examine it carefully because someone sat down and thought about it honestly. "You wrote this yourself?" she asked. "I did. You have decent handwriting for a horsebreaker." My mother insisted. Something moved across his face. She was insistent about a number of things. Maren folded the paper back along its crease. She thought about the 31 days in January. She thought about talking to cattle. She thought about the bar of silence that had grown in this cabin, like a thing that takes up space and breathes air that might otherwise go to a person. She thought about the folded blanket on the floor. "The room in the barn," she said, "the small one at the south end. It's not heated. I've slept in colder. You'll want to make some improvements before June, when it heats the other direction. I can do that, and I'm not cooking 2 separate meals. You eat what I eat when I eat it. That's fine. And there are things on this ranch that I run my way. I don't explain them, I don't defend them, and I don't renegotiate them." She met his eyes. "If you see something you disagree with, you can say so once. Clearly, and then it's my decision." He held her gaze. "Same goes." She considered that. "All right? All right? You can stay." She put the folded paper in her coat pocket. "Unload the wagon. The barn is unlocked." She turned back to the fence line and picked up her pliers and went back to work on the wire. and behind her she heard him begin to move, speaking quietly to Calliope, beginning to unload the wagon. Boots in the spring mud, and the sounds were unremarkable in themselves, just the ordinary sounds of someone working in a yard. But they were sounds in a yard that had been silent since August. She kept working the fence and didn't turn around and didn't acknowledge that she was listening, but she was. The way you listen to something that's been missing and then comes back. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony at all, just the ordinary sound of not being alone. The south fence had 3 more weak sections that needed attention, and she worked through to the last of the afternoon light and then came in and started supper. And when it was ready, she put 2 plates on the table without deliberating about it, which surprised her only slightly. Rhett came in from the barn when the light was fully gone, leaving his outer boots the way she always insisted, though she'd never mentioned it to him, and washed his hands at the basin and sat down across from her at the table. She put a plate in front of him. He looked at the food. Then at her. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make it complicated," she said. He didn't. They ate in a silence that had changed again, had changed from the silence of strangers, and then from the silence of 2 people who knew something about each other, and then into something else. Something that didn't have a simple name, but that Maren recognized in the way you recognize something you thought was gone for good. Company, the plain, unadorned fact of another person at the table. Outside, the April dark was full of creak sounds, and the occasional call of something moving through the field, and the cabin was warm from the stove, and 2 coats hung side by side on the hooks by the door, and Maren looked at them once, and then looked back at her plate. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't planned for it. She wasn't sure what it was yet or what it would become. But the winter was over, and Briar Hollow, for the first time in longer than she could easily account for, did not feel like an ending. The first morning Rhett was officially a working hand at Briar Hollow. He was up before she was. Maren had been waking before dawn, since she was old enough to understand that the ranch didn't wait for anyone's schedule. And she could count on one hand the number of mornings in her adult life she'd come downstairs to find anyone else already stirring. So when she came through the cabin door at 5:15, with her coat half-buttoned and her hair still braided from the night before, and heard sounds already coming from the direction of the barn, the particular rhythm of a pitchfork working through straw, she stopped in the yard for a moment and just stood there. The sky was that particular pre-dawn color that isn't quite dark and isn't quite anything else, more of an absence of light than a presence of it. The creek was running steady. Somewhere across the south field, a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do, regardless of whether anyone is awake to hear it. She went to the barn. Rhett had already mucked 2 of the stalls and was starting on the 3rd. He'd found where she kept the wheelbarrow without asking. He was working at the pace of a man who'd been doing physical labor his whole life, not fast, exactly, but efficient in the way that comes from years of knowing how to move without wasting motion. He looked up when she came in. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "I found the tin." She looked at him. "I was going to do the stalls." "I know, I did them first." He went back to the pitchfork. "Your water check is more important. I can do this." "You should go." She stood there for another moment, and the honest truth was she didn't know what to do with it, not the gesture, not the practicality of it. Not the fact that someone had made coffee and mucked stalls and was telling her to go do the thing that actually needed her specifically. She'd been organizing her own mornings alone for 8 months, and the reorganization required by having another capable person in the operation felt like a math problem she hadn't studied for. "I'll check the water," she said. "That's what I said." She went. They settled into a rhythm over the first 2 weeks that neither of them designed on purpose. It just formed the way paths form from repeated walking in the same direction until the ground gives in and holds the shape. She did the water checks and the cattle counts and the fence line assessments. He did the barn maintenance, the structural repairs that had been on the list since August, and anything that required sustained heavy labor. They overlapped in the middle moving stock, the morning and evening feeding runs, the ongoing assessment of what needed doing next, and in that overlap, they developed the particular shorthand of people who work together and pay attention. He learned that when she went quiet in the middle of a task, she was calculating, not unhappy, and didn't need to be talked to. She learned that when he paused and looked at something from a different angle without moving, he'd seen something wrong and was deciding the best approach before committing. They stopped explaining themselves to each other as much because a lot of the time they didn't need to. It wasn't seamless. They argued twice in the first 2 weeks, both times about method. The first argument was about the barn brace repair. He wanted to use a more standard approach sister boards on either side of the compromised upright, standard county practice, the way every rancher in the territory did it. She looked at it and said it wouldn't hold, because the problem wasn't the upright, it was the footing the upright was sitting on. And if they didn't address the footing, the sister boards would just give them 2 more boards that eventually failed the same way. He disagreed, clearly and directly, which she respected, but he was wrong. They stood in the barn for 20 minutes, saying the same things in different orders, and then she picked up a shovel and dug around the base of the upright and showed him the footing, which had rotted out over several years of inadequate drainage, and he crouched down and looked at it for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right, what? You're right." He stood up. "How do you want to approach the footing?" She blinked. She hadn't been expecting it to resolve that fast. Most men she'd encountered took longer to get from "you're right" to "what do you want to do," if they got there at all. "I'll need to dig out around the base," she said, recovering. "About a foot radius. Then we reset with packed gravel for drainage and pour new concrete if we can get it. Otherwise we use the lime mix. I can have concrete here in 3 days. Then we wait 3 days." She looked at him. "Do you always concede that quickly? When someone's right, yes." He picked up his own shovel. "When they're wrong, no." He glanced at her. "You'll find that out eventually." She did, in fact, find that out. The second argument was about the water conduit redesign, and that one was harder to resolve because they were both partially right. He wanted to add a redundant pipe run as backup, which made structural sense, but which she thought was too complicated to maintain solo if something went wrong in winter conditions. She wanted to focus on making the single conduit more robust and accessible rather than adding complexity. They went 3 rounds on it over 2 evenings at the dinner table, and on the third night she drew it out on paper, and so did he, and they spread both drawings on the table and looked at them. "Yours is better in theory," she said finally. "Yours is better in practice," he said. "What if we take your redundancy concept, but simplify it down to a single accessible junction point instead of a full parallel run?" He looked at her drawing, then at his one junction, with a removable cover that I can reach without a ladder in the dark. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took her drawing and added something to it, a specific placement for the junction, up from where she'd sketched it, at a height and angle she could reach without extending her arm fully above her head. A detail she wouldn't have thought to specify because she'd been working with what she had for so long that she'd stopped noticing her own workarounds. She looked at the addition, then at him. "When did you measure that?" she said. "I didn't. I watched you reach the top rail of the fence yesterday." He set the pencil down. "You favor your left arm when you have to reach above shoulder height." Old injury? She'd broken her right collarbone at 17. It had healed wrong. She'd never mentioned it to anyone because it wasn't the kind of thing you mentioned. It just was. "Yes," she said. "The junction should be where you can reach it with your left arm without overextending." He looked at the drawing again. "We can do it that way." She folded the drawing carefully and put it in the cabinet where she kept important papers and did not say anything about that specific exchange for the rest of the evening because she didn't know what to say about it. No one had ever looked at how she moved and adjusted to it. Not even her father, who had loved her completely, but had taught her by telling her how things should be done rather than watching how she actually did them. May became June. And June was good to Briar Hollow in the way that Montana Junes can be long light. the grass growing back faster than it had any right to after the winter that had just passed, the cattle filling out. The weak calf she'd hauled through the cold, the one that had spent 3 days sleeping near her stove, was now doing better than 2 of the animals twice his age. She didn't point that out to anyone, but she noticed it. Rhett finished the barn brace repair in the 2nd week of May, and it was good work. Not showy, but solid in a way that made her realize, looking at it, just how close the original had been to failing. He'd done the footing properly, the upright was true, and he'd added a secondary drainage channel that would keep water from working at the base through the freeze-thaw cycles. She looked at it for a while and then said, "Good job," and went back to what she was doing, and that was that. He had a way of taking a compliment that she appreciated. He just nodded and moved on. He didn't deflect it awkwardly, and he didn't expand on it, and he didn't use it as an opening to talk about himself. He just took it and kept working. She'd known men who couldn't do that, who turned every acknowledgement into a referendum on their own character, and it had always exhausted her. The thing that nobody had warned her about, though the thing she hadn't calculated for when she'd agreed to his terms in April, was the neighbors. The first indication came from Agnes Pruitt, whose husband ran the small supply store 4 miles east on the Harlan Road. Agnes was a decent woman with good intentions and a limited radius of imagination, and she came by in late May, ostensibly to return a baking tin she'd borrowed from Maren's mother years ago and had apparently felt guilty about since. She stayed for coffee, which Maren provided because it was expected, and spent the visit talking around the perimeter of what she'd actually come to ask until finally. With her tin in her hands and 1 foot already pointed toward the door, she said it. "People are talking, Maren." Maren was washing the coffee cups. "Talk. You've got a man living on the property." "I've got a working hand. The arrangement is formal and documented." She set a cup down. "He stays in the barn room. He works for room and board." "Those are the terms." Agnes pressed her lips together in a way that said she understood the terms and also understood that the terms were not the issue. "There are ways these things look." "I know how they look," Maren said. "I also know how 38 cattle and a failing barn look, and I know which problem I had to solve first." Agnes left shortly after that, and Maren stood in the kitchen and was honest with herself for a moment about the fact that her stomach had tightened during that conversation in a way that had less to do with offense and more to do with something underneath offense, the knowledge. That Agnes was not wrong about the optics, and that the territory's opinion of a woman mattered in concrete ways that had nothing to do with fairness. She didn't bring it up with Rhett that evening. She brought it up 2 weeks later, when it stopped being possible to pretend it was isolated. The cattle buyer, a man named Voss, who came through the territory in June to make preliminary arrangements for fall purchases, stopped at Briar Hollow the way he stopped at all the ranches, making notes and offering preliminary figures. Maren had dealt with Voss before, had dealt with his type before, the kind of man who quoted you a price in a pleasant voice while watching your eyes to see how desperate you were. She dealt with that last year with her father ill and the finances already stretched, and she'd managed. This year Voss arrived, looked around the yard, watched Rhett moving lumber from the wagon to the east side of the barn, and revised his preliminary figure downward by 11% from what he'd quoted the ranch the previous fall. He didn't explain the revision. He put it out there the way you put a card on the table, showing just enough to make his point. Maren stood in the yard with her arms at her sides and her jaw set and looked at the figure on his paper. "The herd is in better condition than last year," she said. "The winter losses were lower. The calf percentage is up." "The market's been soft," Voss said pleasantly. "The market's been exactly where it was in October." She looked up from the paper. "Is there another reason for this figure?" Voss glanced toward where Rhett was working. Something moved across his face, not quite a smirk, something that thought it was subtler than a smirk. "I just like to be conservative when I'm uncertain about the stability of an operation." She understood what he was saying. She was meant to understand it. "The operation is stable," she said. "The terms I want are these." She named her price. It was fair, not greedy, but fair, and she didn't back off it or hedge it or soften it. She said it plainly and waited. Voss made a non-committal sound and said he'd be in touch. She watched him ride back down the road and then turned and went into the barn and stood there for a minute in the smell of hay and horses until her jaw unclenched. Rhett appeared in the barn door behind her. He'd seen Voss leave. "Trouble?" he asked. "No," she turned around. "I need to tell you something." She told him about Agnes, about Voss, about the shape of what was happening. She didn't soften it, and she didn't ask for his opinion on the fairness of it, because the fairness of it was not the point. The point was that it was happening, and it affected both of them, and he needed to know. He listened without interrupting. Which she'd noticed was something he did. He actually listened. The whole time, not the way some people listen, where you can see them waiting for their turn to talk. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "What I want and what the practical options are might be different." "Tell me both." She looked at him. "What I want is for it not to matter." "What the practical options are," she stopped, thought. "I could ask you to find other accommodations in Harlan and come out for day work only. That resolves the visible issue. It also cuts my effectiveness in half and means you're alone out here again at night." "I know. What else? I could ask you to leave entirely." "Tell the neighbors the arrangement was temporary." She paused. "I'm not going to do that." "Why not?" "Because the barn needs 2 more weeks of work, and the water conduit isn't started yet. And you fixed a problem I'd been working around for a year without me having to explain what the problem was. And I'm not interested in managing appearances at the expense of managing this ranch." She said it evenly as a fact. "So that leaves the third option, which is, we keep going. We do the work. We don't hide it and we don't apologize for it, and eventually the results speak for themselves, or they don't." She met his eyes. "Some of the credit tightening might be real. Voss might lowball me in the fall. Those are costs. I'm calculating whether I'm willing to pay them." He waited. "I am," she said, "if you are." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then I signed a contract. A contract you can get out of if the situation has become more complicated than you anticipated. Maren." He said her name the same way he had in November, flat and clear. "I don't get out of things." She nodded once briefly. "All right, then." She went back to her water calculation, and he went back to the lumber, and neither of them said anything more about it, and that was as much of an agreement as either of them needed. The water conduit redesign began in the 2nd week of June. It was the most technically complex thing she'd attempted on the ranch since her father died, and it took 2.5 weeks, which was a week longer than she'd planned, because they hit a section of ground that was harder than expected, and the tool she needed to break it up was not the tool she had. And there was a day and a half where they both stood looking at the problem, and neither of them had an immediate solution. That period, a day and a half of not knowing, turned out to be one of the most useful things that happened that summer. Because during that day and a half they talked. Not about the conduit exactly. Or not only about it, they talked about water and drainage in general, about what she'd observed, about snowmelt patterns on the property over the years, about the way the north slope shed water differently than the south slope because of the angle of the prevailing wind, about 2 winters when the creek had run unusually high, and what she'd noticed about where the excess water had gone. She'd never said most of this out loud because there had been no one to say it to. Her father had known the land, but he'd known it in his body, the way people know things they learned as children, and he hadn't needed to talk through it. Rhett listened to all of it, and at the end of it, he looked at the problem differently and said, "The ground is harder here, because you've got a different substrate. Look at the color change, about 8 inches down. We're not in topsoil anymore, we're in the clay layer." He crouched down and picked up a handful of the material. "Which actually tells us something useful. Clay holds water. If we angle the conduit run 3 degrees north from here, we'll hit topsoil again, and the digging gets easier, and the clay layer becomes a natural base that'll keep the pipe from settling." She crouched beside him and looked at the color change in the earth. He was right. 3 degrees, she said. Approximately. You know your angles by eye? My father built furniture. He made me learn sighting before he let me touch a saw. He stood up. I hated it at the time. She looked at the earth for another moment. My father made me memorize every fence line on this property in the dark. Walk them blind, he said. You need to know it in your feet, not just your eyes. Did you hate it? She thought about it honestly. No. I was annoyed by it. There's a difference. She stood up. 3 degrees north. 3 degrees north. The conduit was finished by the end of June and was, without question, the best piece of infrastructure on the property. It was accessible. It was insulated properly. The junction point sat at exactly the right height. She tested it 3 different ways and it held, and when she straightened up from the final check, she felt the particular satisfaction that comes not just from completion, but from doing something right after a period of doing it inadequately. It'll hold, she said. It'll hold, he agreed. She looked at him and then looked away, and the summer evening was long and light, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture, and somewhere the meadowlark was still working its single repeated opinion into the air. July came, and with July came a change in the neighborhood's approach to Briar Hollow that she hadn't entirely anticipated. The results, it turned out, were visible enough to generate their own conversation. The barn repair held. The cattle count held. When Tom Belair from the ranch 2 miles north rode over to borrow a chain binder in late July, he stayed longer than necessary and walked around the barn in a way that was too careful and quiet to be casual. She let him look. That footing repair, he said finally, standing in front of the upright. Who did the work? Rhett, she said, and I designed the drainage channel. He crouched down and looked at the drainage channel for a while. He said, which from Tom Belair was nearly a speech. He came back 2 weeks later with a footing problem of his own and asked if Rhett was available to look at it. Rhett went. She heard the report when he came back that evening, and she didn't make anything of it. But she was aware that the conversation about Briar Hollow had shifted slightly in the neighborhood, and the shift was in the direction of the work rather than the whispers. Silas Rourke, however, was a different matter. Silas was the largest rancher in the county, or had been for 20 years, and his opinion of things carried weight that wasn't entirely earned but was entirely real. He was in his late 50s, had outlasted 2 wives and several business partners, and had a certainty about himself that had probably been useful in his youth and had calcified over the years into something closer to contempt. He didn't speak badly about Briar Hollow directly. He wasn't crude. He was worse than crude. He was dismissive, which is the form of cruelty that doesn't leave marks. He mentioned once at the Harlan feed store, in front of 3 other ranchers, and within earshot of someone who mentioned it, to someone who eventually mentioned it to Maren, that it was a shame what happened to Daniel Whitlock's place Good Land, getting wasted on a girl who should find herself a proper situation. Maren heard about this on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, she had made a decision that she didn't share with Rhett and didn't second guess. She would build the windbreak. She had been thinking about it since March, since the worst of the blizzard had come through, and she'd stood at the barn entrance at 2 in the morning in the dark, watching the snow accumulate against the barn's east face, and understood, in a way that felt like something falling into place rather than something newly learned, that the problem wasn't the snow. The problem was where the snow was landing. The barn entrance faced north-northeast. The prevailing winter wind in this part of the territory came from the northwest. A solid barrier, which was what every other rancher in the county used, solid board fencing or packed brush, would stop the wind but push the snow deposit in front of it, which put the deposit directly in front of the barn entrance. She'd seen it at 2 other ranches. She'd seen men digging out their own barn doors in blizzard conditions because their wind barriers had created the very drifts that blocked them. What you needed was not to stop the wind. You needed to weaken it and redirect it. She'd worked this out in her head over the winter, the way she worked things out lying in the dark, listening to the wind and thinking about angles. An open barrier, willow branches, not boards, gaps that the wind could move through but at reduced velocity, spreading and slowing, losing the directional force that drove the snow to pile. deposit would still happen, but it would happen further from the barn, in the open field where it didn't matter. She told Rhett about it on a Thursday evening, drawing it out on paper the same way she'd drawn the conduit. He looked at it for a long time. "It'll look unfinished," he said finally. "It will be unfinished. That's how it works. People are going to see gaps in your fence and assume you ran out of materials." "Let them assume." She tapped the paper. "Does the principle make sense to you?" He was quiet for another minute. She watched him thinking, which was one of the things she'd gotten used to. He actually thought before he spoke, which was less common than it should have been. "The principle makes sense," he said. "You're using the barrier to create turbulence rather than deflection." "Yes. If the gaps are wrong, too wide or too narrow, it doesn't work. The wind either comes through at speed or deflects sideways, and you still get a pile at the entrance." "I know. I've been calculating the gap ratio." She turned the paper around. She'd worked out the numbers on the back. Not equations exactly, because she didn't have formal training in that language, but a ratio table built from observation wind speed versus drift distance at 3 different barrier densities she'd measured against natural features on the property. He looked at the table for a long time without speaking. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "I didn't learn it. I worked it out." She said it simply, without defensiveness, because it was just the truth. He set the paper down. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the footing problem, the way he looked at things he was seeing clearly for the first time. Then he said, "Willow branches. They're flexible enough to handle the load without snapping in a freeze, and they have enough natural irregularity to create the gap variation we need. We'll need to harvest them in the next few weeks before they lose flexibility." "I know, that's why I'm telling you now." He nodded. And then he said, "The placement you wanted at an angle, not parallel to the barn face. More like." He reached for the pencil. 30 degrees off the face, she said. "So the wind hits the barrier at an oblique angle, and the turbulence dissipates into the field." He lowered the pencil. He looked at her. 30 degrees, he said. "Approximately." Something passed across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was something she'd started to recognize the expression he made when he'd misjudged the scope of something and was quietly recalibrating. "We should start Monday," he said. "We start Monday," she said. They harvested willow branches through the first 2 weeks of August, working in the early mornings before the heat built, and began the construction of a thing that looked like nothing the county had seen before: an angled barrier of woven willow, set back from the barn with deliberate gaps placed at intervals that Maren had spent 3 months calculating. It took them longer than planned because real work always does, and they had to redo one section when the angle was off by more than the margin she'd set, and she caught it herself before he pointed it out. Silas Rourke came by on a Tuesday in late August with one of his hands. He looked at the windbreak from the road for a while before he turned in. He walked the length of it. He looked at the gaps. He looked at the placement relative to the barn. He stood with his thumbs in his belt and his head tilted, and then he looked at Maren, who was standing 12 feet away with her arms at her sides. He laughed, actually laughed, threw his head back, the way she'd been watching him do since she was a child, the laugh he deployed when something confirmed his lowest expectations of the person presenting it. "Girl," he said, "you'd do better hanging laundry than building fences." His man laughed too, slightly behind the beat, the laugh of someone following a cue. Rhett took one step forward. It was a small step, and he didn't say anything, but she felt it beside her, and she put her hand on his forearm without looking at him. She looked at Silas. She did not say anything about the gap ratio calculations. She did not explain the turbulence principle or the drift displacement theory or the 3 months of observation that had preceded this construction. She did not point out the ratio table, which would have been meaningless to him anyway. She just looked at him and said, "November will settle it." Silas looked back at her for a moment with the particular look of a man who cannot imagine being wrong and cannot imagine what to do with someone who doesn't react to him in the expected way. Then he tipped his hat in a motion that was technically polite and rode back out the gate. Maren watched him go. Rhett came to stand beside her. They both looked at the windbreak for a moment in the afternoon light, its gaps deliberate and open, its angle precise, its willow branches already beginning to knit together where she'd woven them. "November," he said. "November," she said. She turned back toward the ranch. There were 8 weeks until the first hard frost, and she intended to use every one of them. The 8 weeks between Silas Rourke's laughter and the first hard frost were the most productive of Maren's adult life, and also the most complicated, and those two things were not unrelated. September at Briar Hollow had always been a month of preparation. Her father had called it the accounting month, the time when you added up what you had and measured it against what was coming and adjusted accordingly. She'd inherited that habit the way she'd inherited most of his useful ones, by watching him do it until it became instinct. But this September was different from any she'd managed before, because for the first time she wasn't doing the accounting alone, and having a second mind in the calculation changed the numbers in ways she was still getting used to. They finished the windbreak's primary structure in the first week of September, and spent the second week reinforcing the anchor posts, which Rhett had insisted needed to go deeper than her original plan. He'd seen windbreaks fail. Not because the design was wrong, but because the posts had been set assuming average winters, and Montana did not trade in averages. She'd pushed back on the labor cost in time, because September was already crowded with other work, and they'd spent an evening arguing it through until she looked at the anchor depth he was proposing and did the math on soil freeze depth and accepted that he was right. She didn't like being wrong. She was honest with herself about that. But she'd noticed, over the summer, that being wrong with Rhett in the room was a different experience than she expected. He didn't hold it over her, didn't bring it back up, didn't use it as a reference point the next time they disagreed. He just moved on, which meant she could move on too, and the disagreement became useful information rather than a wound that needed managing. The cattle needed to be assessed for winter before October. She and Rhett went through the herd together one afternoon in mid-September, which was not something she'd ever done with another person. Her father had done it alone, and she'd done it alone, and the process had been internal, a private calculation carried in her head. Doing it with Rhett meant saying her assessments out loud as she made them, and saying them out loud made her aware of how much of her ranching knowledge existed in a form that had never been translated into language. She could look at a cow and know things. She couldn't always immediately explain what she was seeing that told her those things. "This one," she said, stopping at a 4-year-old roan that had come through the previous winter lighter than she should have. "She's going to need supplemental feeds starting in October." Rhett looked at the animal. "What are you seeing?" "Her condition is good right now, but she drops weight faster than the others in cold. I've watched her 2 winters. She paused, looking for the words. "The way she holds her back changes. When she gets cold-stressed, she rounds up, tucks her hindquarters under. The others don't do that as early. It means she's burning more to stay warm." He looked at the roan for a moment, then at Maren. "How many winters did it take you to notice that?" "First winter, I thought she was just a poor keeper. Second winter, I started watching her against the others. Third winter, I understood the pattern. She moved on to the next animal. My father used to say you don't really know cattle until you've watched the same ones through 3 bad winters." He wasn't wrong. He was wrong about several things. She said it without heat. Just honestly, but not that one. Rhett looked at her sidelong. What was he wrong about? She was quiet for a moment. They moved along the herd together, and the afternoon light was doing what September light does in Montana, going golden and low earlier than you expected, reminding you that the long summer evenings were a gift that was almost spent. "He thought this ranch was too much for me," she said finally. "Not because he didn't believe in me. He did. But he believed I'd eventually leave, find a husband, let the ranch move somewhere easier." She checked a heifer's ears for cold damage from last winter, force of habit. He never said it directly, but I could see it in how he planned. He never made the long repairs, always the short ones. Like he was keeping it going until someone else took it over. And you're making the long repairs. I'm making the long repairs. He didn't say anything to that, which was the right response. There was nothing to add, and he seemed to know it. They finished the herd assessment, and she had numbers in her head that felt more reliable than usual, because she'd said them out loud, and Rhett had asked questions that made her examine her assumptions. October arrived with a cold that had an edge to it, not bitter yet, but purposeful. The kind of cold that was announcing its intentions. The first thing October took was the last of the cooperative weather for outdoor heavy work. They had 2 weeks at most before any serious construction became miserable. And there was one item still on the list that Maren had been putting off, not because she didn't know what to do, but because doing it required decisions she hadn't fully made yet. The calf shelter. The northeast corner of the barn, the corner she'd reinforced with spare lumber in January, where the weakest animals huddled because the body heat collected there, was not a real solution. It was a continuation of the same improvised approach that had been the ranch's mode of operation for too long. What she wanted was a dedicated space for vulnerable animals, ventilated to prevent the respiratory problems that came from enclosing animals in stale air, but insulated enough to give them warmth without the cold stress that cost them weight and sometimes cost them their lives. Every calf shelter she'd seen in the county was a solid box. Warm, yes, but the one she'd visited in February she'd gone to look specifically after her own calf nearly died had a smell in them that told a story about air quality. Animals in those shelters didn't die from the cold. But they had harder springs than they should have, slower recoveries, more respiratory problems. She wanted something different. She and Rhett spent 3 evenings on it. It was the longest design conversation they'd had, longer than the conduit, longer than the windbreak, because this one required thinking about things that were harder to measure. How cold was too cold for a newborn calf? How much air exchange was enough versus too much? Where the balance point was between warmth and circulation. You can't test it before winter, Rhett said on the second evening. Whatever we build, we're building on prediction. Everything out here is prediction. You build on what you know and adjust when you're wrong. She looked at the barn plans she'd laid out. The ventilation has to be indirect. Not open gaps air needs to move through a channel that breaks the direct wind path. Like the windbreak principle, exactly like that. The air enters through a channel built at an angle so it moves, but it doesn't knife through. She traced the proposed channel on the plan. It reduces temperature of the incoming air by about 1/3 compared to direct entry. He looked at where she was pointing. How do you know 1/3? I measured it in February. I had a gap in the barn wall, not intentional. The planking had warped, and I noticed the cattle avoided the area directly in front of it, but congregated about 4 feet behind where the airflow lost its force. She'd thought about this for months. 4 feet, roughly the airspeed drops below what registers as a draft. That's where they stood. That was my measurement. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him taking that in. You figured out airflow dynamics from watching where cold cattle stood in February, he said. I figured out where to put the ventilation channel, she corrected. The physics were already there. I just looked at them. On the 3rd evening, they had a plan. It wasn't what she'd originally sketched in her head. Rhett had added a detail about the floor material that she hadn't considered, a sand base rather than pure compacted earth, which drained better and stayed drier. And dry bedding in a calf shelter was worth more than almost anything else. She'd added the angled ventilation channel and specified placement high on the south wall where rising warm air from the animals would create a gentle updraft that pulled fresh air through without creating a cold floor draft. Together, it was better than either version alone would have been. She noticed that too. She noticed it and sat with it because it contradicted something she'd believed about herself, that she worked best alone, thought best alone, that other people in her process created friction rather than improvement. Rhett didn't create friction. He created questions that made her answers better. They built the calf shelter in the first 2 weeks of October, And it was harder than expected because the weather came early that year, a cold snap in the second week that made working with the materials genuinely unpleasant. Her hands cracked in the dry cold the way they always did, and she dealt with it the way she always did, which was lanolin at night and ignoring it during the day. Rhett noticed the cracked knuckles and didn't say anything about them, which she preferred to the alternative. The shelter was finished on October 17th. She stood inside it for a while, which she hadn't planned to do. She'd intended to assess it from the doorway, but she stepped inside and let her eyes adjust and stood there. The ventilation worked. She could feel air moving, not as a draft, but as a circulation, the particular quality of air that wasn't stale but wasn't cold either. The floor was dry. The space was sized for 4 to 6 animals without crowding. Rhett appeared in the doorway behind her. "Well, come in and tell me what you feel." He stepped inside, stood still. She watched him take it in the same way he'd taken in the footing problem, the conduit, the windbreak gap calculations, with the focused attention of someone who was actually assessing rather than looking for what they expected to find. "Air moves but doesn't cut," he said. "Yes. Floor's warmer than I expected. The sand holds a small amount of heat from the animals better than earth does." "Not much enough." He turned slowly, looking at all 4 walls. "You know this is genuinely good," he said, not as a compliment to her, more as a statement of fact that he was making to the room or to himself. "I think it'll work," she said, which for her was almost the same thing. They came out of the shelter, and the October afternoon was sharp-edged and gray, and there was a smell in the air that the territory's longtime residents recognized without being able to define the smell of an early and significant winter coming. Not just cold, something with weight to it. Maren stood in the barn lot and breathed it in. "Early," she said. 2 weeks, maybe 3, Rhett said. He was reading the sky the way she was, the particular cloud formation on the northwest horizon that meant business. "We need more feed in the barn. I'll go to Harlan tomorrow. And the windbreak south anchor, post the 3rd one. I want it checked again. I don't trust the depth in that section. I'll do it this afternoon." She looked at him. He was already looking at the northwest horizon, thinking through his own list. He had that quality she'd noticed in August. He took on the ranch's problems as his own, not as tasks assigned to him by her, but as things that mattered and needed doing. She'd worked beside men before who worked for you and men who worked with you, and the difference was not about effort. It was about where the problem lived in their heads. With Rhett, it lived in the same place it lived in hers. She didn't examine that thought too closely. She went to check the water conduit fittings before the light went. The second week of October brought Voss back. She'd been expecting it fall always brought the cattle buyers through, but she hadn't expected him to bring a man with him that she didn't recognize. A man with the particular clothes and manner of someone who worked in a bank or an office rather than on land. Voss introduced him as a business associate and didn't say more than that. They walked the herd. Maren walked with them. Rhett was in the barn and stayed there, which was the right call. This was her negotiation, and she didn't need anyone standing beside her. Voss put a number on the table that was 10% below last year's. Not 11% below what he'd offered in June, which had been a test. This was a real offer. 10% below last year, and last year had already been below fair. She looked at the number, and then at Voss. "My herd is in better condition than any year in the past 4, she said. "My loss rate this past winter was 3%. County average was 9. She looked at the bank man. "Whoever is financing this purchase should know that Briar Hollow cattle have demonstrated a consistent health advantage over the county average. That's a known quality, and it has a price." Voss looked at her steadily. He was recalibrating. She could see it. He'd come expecting the financial pressure of last fall, a woman alone and under-resourced, who needed the sale badly enough to take what she was offered. The barn behind her was in better repair than it had been in 10 years. The windbreak stood at its precise angle on the property's edge. The water conduit had a visible professional junction housing that anyone who knew infrastructure could read as serious work. Briar Hollow did not look like a struggling ranch anymore. It looked like a ranch that had been thought about. "I'll need to discuss the pricing structure," Voss said, which was not a concession but was not a refusal either. "You know where to find me," she said. They left. She went back the barn and picked up the tool she'd set down when they'd ridden in and went back to work without saying anything, and Rhett went back to what he'd been doing without asking, because he understood that she'd handled it, and the handling was hers. He came back later that afternoon with a fair price from Voss delivered in writing, which was 3% above last year. Not everything she'd wanted, enough. She signed the paper and felt the particular satisfaction of a battle won through preparation rather than confrontation. Rhett fixed the third anchor post that afternoon and confirmed her suspicion it had been set 6 inches shallower than the others due to a patch of rock they'd hit during construction and worked around without flagging. He reset it properly. The windbreak was now, in his assessment, anchored for whatever November decided to throw at it. November made its decision on the 9th. The sky the night of the 8th had a color to it at sunset that she'd seen only a handful of times in her life, not just red, but a deep purplish red at the base of the northwest sky, concentrated and dark, the kind of sky that her father had taken as a sign to triple-check everything. She and Rhett did exactly that on the evening of the 8th, going through the property in the last light, checking every anchor, every fitting, every access point on the conduit, the calf shelter bedding, the barn doors, the feed supply, the water access. It took until after dark. They came inside with frost already on their coats. "How bad?" Rhett asked. She'd been watching Montana skies her entire life. "Worse than last year," she said. The storm hit at 3 in the morning. Not with the gradual buildup of the November storm that had brought Rhett to her fence line a year ago. This one came with no warning past that sky. 1 hour there was wind, the next there was everything. Wind and snow horizontal, and a cold that dropped so fast she could hear the barn wood contracting when she opened the cabin door to assess. She went out. She hadn't planned to go out immediately. The protocol in a hard blizzard was to wait for the first lull rather than fight the peak, but she heard something from the direction of the windbreak that she didn't like. A crack sharp and distinct through the wind's constant noise. She got her outer layers on faster than she'd ever done it and was through the door with a lantern before Rhett reached the cabin from the barn room, which told her he'd heard it too. He was right behind her. They fought through to the windbreak together, which was harder going than last November, because this storm had a more direct north-northwest vector. The wind was hitting them more head-on. She kept her face down and navigated by the rope she'd strung between the cabin and the barn earlier in the evening. Standard precaution, her father's lesson. The rope held. She followed it. The crack had been the southernmost willow section, a point where 3 branches had been woven together, and the ice load on the outer face had created a torque that the weave hadn't held. One brace had snapped cleanly. The section was deflecting, bowing out in the wrong direction, potentially threatening to pull the anchor post. She assessed it in the lantern light with the wind, trying to take the lantern, and her free hand gripping the anchor post. "It's not going to cascade," she said, not to reassure Rhett, to confirm her own assessment. "The post is holding. One brace gone, the section is flexible enough that it's deforming rather than transferring load to the adjacent sections. The deformation is going to increase through the night," he said. He had his hand on the brace above the break, feeling the tension. "I know. Can we reinforce it now?" They tried. They spent 40 minutes in the storm attempting to reinforce the broken brace with what they'd brought, which was the materials she'd staged in the barn, knowing they might need them wire, extra willow stems from the pile she'd kept, the tools. The cold made everything harder. The wire didn't flex right. Her fingers went from numb to a level past numb, and Rhett's at one point were so cold he had to stop and warm them inside his coat for 3 minutes while she held the section. In the end, they got it stable enough. Not perfect. Not what they'd do in daylight under normal conditions. But stable. They came back inside, and Maren stood at the stove and held her hands over the heat and didn't speak for several minutes. The storm howled outside with a voice that seemed personal. The conduit cover, Rhett said from across the room. She'd forgotten. Which junction? The barn end. I saw ice on the housing when we came back through. If it freezes around the cover, I know. She put her gloves back on. She was so tired she felt it in her teeth. I'll go. I'll go. Your hands are worse than mine right now. He opened his mouth, and she looked at him, and something in her expression closed the argument. He stayed. She went back out. The junction housing had, as he'd predicted, developed a rim of ice around the removable cover, the melt from the barn's heat, reaching the metal fitting, and then refreezing in the ambient air. She worked at it carefully with the small mallet she'd brought, not hammering tapping, working around the perimeter, breaking the ice seal without damaging the housing. Took 11 minutes, she counted. The cover came free. She checked the interior, cleared the small amount of ice that had formed on the valve, seated the cover again, and tapped it back into its seal. The water was running. She came back in and didn't say anything, and went to the stove and stayed there until her core temperature came back up enough that she stopped shaking. Rhett had made coffee at some point. She didn't ask when. She just picked up the cup he'd put on the table and drank it. The windbreak's working, he said after a while. You can't see anything out there. We will when it's light. She nodded. She was thinking about the barn entrance. The drift would either be in front of it or it wouldn't, and she wouldn't know until morning. And there was nothing left to do about it tonight, and she needed to sit down. She sat in her father's chair. Rhett sat across from her. The storm beat against the cabin in waves. Each wave slightly different from the last, gusting and then sustaining and then gusting again, and they sat in the noise of it and drank their coffee and didn't say much because everything that needed doing had been done. And now it was a matter of what the storm decided. Somewhere past 4 in the morning, while the storm was still at its peak, something struck the outer gate. Not the wind. The gate had its own sound, the particular clang of the iron latch in wind, and she knew that sound, and this wasn't it. This was impact, something hitting the gate from the outside. She and Rhett both heard it. He was already standing. She was half a step behind him. He got to the window, and she got to the door, and she opened it enough to see out, holding against the wind with her shoulder. On the other side of the gate, barely visible through the horizontal snow, were the dark shapes of 2 horses. One of them was moving in a distressed, exhausted way. She recognized the specific movement of an animal that had been going too long in bad conditions and was running on something past will. The other was standing with its head low. There was a rider on each. One of the riders was not moving. She was through the door before she'd finished the thought. Getting to the gate was bad. The snow was mid-thigh in the drift that had formed along the fence line, not in front of the barn. She registered in some back part of her mind, in front of the fence, the way she'd predicted, and she pushed through it and got the gate latch open, and the horses came through, the distressed one first, and then the standing one. The rider on the distressed horse was a woman, older. Her face was frostbitten at the cheeks and her eyes were barely open, and she was hanging in the saddle the way Rhett had been hanging in the saddle a year ago. The grip of a person who has been unconscious and whose hands hadn't gotten the message yet. The rider on the second horse was a man, and he was conscious, and he was looking at Maren through the snow with an expression she'd never expected to see on that particular face. Silas Rourke, his wife, was the one barely in the saddle. He was the one still upright, but barely he had the look of a man who had been holding everything together through will alone and was very close to the end of what that will could manage. "My wall," he said, and she could barely hear him over the storm. Solid wall. Drifted over the cattle entrance. We couldn't, he stopped. His voice was going. "Eleanor, I see her," Maren said. Rhett was already there. They got Eleanor Rourke down from the horse the same way Maren had gotten Rhett down a year ago, not gracefully, not efficiently, with the lurching, awkward effort of real emergency in real weather. She was breathing. She was cold in a way that needed addressing immediately. Silas came down off his own horse, and his legs nearly gave, and Rhett caught his arm and held him up, and the 4 of them made it through the yard and through the cabin door and inside. Maren went to Eleanor first. The older woman's hands were the worst exposure to cold long enough that the color was wrong. Not the angry red of recent chill, but the pale, waxy look that was more serious. She got Eleanor's outer layers off and got her near the stove and wrapped her and began doing what needed doing. The methodical, careful work of warming someone who needed to be warmed slowly and correctly. Rhett dealt with Silas, who was less severely compromised but who sank into a chair like someone had cut the strings and sat there looking at his wife with a fear in his face that was entirely unguarded. Entirely human. The fear of a man watching someone he loves and being unable to do anything. "She'll be all right," Maren said, not looking up from her work. She said it not to be comforting, but because she believed it. The color was returning to Eleanor's face. The breathing was steadying. The responses she was getting when she spoke to the woman were foggy but present. Silas didn't say anything. She kept working. After an hour, Eleanor was conscious enough to speak, which she did in fragments, cold. She said, "So cold. I told him the wall wasn't right. I told him before the storm." She said the last part without heat, not blaming, just stating. The way women who have been married a long time sometimes say true things without turning them into weapons. Silas heard it. He sat very still and heard it. Rhett had put a blanket around the older man's shoulders at some point and made him drink broth. The same broth Maren kept going through winter. The same thing she'd given Rhett a year ago on a floor that now felt like a different version of this room. The symmetry of it wasn't lost on her. She didn't remark on it. She just kept working. Sometime before dawn, the storm began to ease. Not stop, but ease. The way this particular storm had to have some mercy in it somewhere, or it would have gone on until it broke something that couldn't be fixed. The horizontal quality of the snow gentled into something more vertical. The wind dropped from its sustained roar to something intermittent. Eleanor slept. Silas sat beside her chair and didn't sleep. Maren went to the window in the early gray light and looked out. Barn was visible. The path to the barn was clear enough to assess. The windbreak stood at its angle, the repaired southern section still in place, deformed slightly from the night's load, but holding. And in the field beyond the windbreak, where the open space ran to the south fence, the snow had piled. A drift that would have been impressive even for this territory chest height, maybe higher in the center. Formed in the field away from the barn entrance. The entrance itself was clear. Not completely clear, there were a few inches of accumulation in front of the doors, which was unavoidable but passable. Accessible. Not the wall of snow that would have been there if the drift had formed where it formed at every other ranch in the county. She stood at the window and looked at it for a while. Rhett came to stand beside her. He looked at the same thing she was looking at. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Silas, from his chair across the room, said, "What is it?" "Come and see," Maren said. The older man got up stiffly and came to the window and looked out. He looked at the clear barn entrance. He looked at the drift in the field. He looked at the windbreak standing at its precise angle. He was quiet for a long time. She watched him looking at it. She watched him doing the math, the same math she'd done in her head over 3 months last winter, the math about where snow goes, and why, and what you can do to change the answer. She watched him understand it. He didn't say anything immediately. She didn't prompt him. After a while he said, "My drift came up over the cattle entrance entirely." The solid wall deflected the load straight down. He said it as a man saying a thing to himself rather than to anyone in the room. "I had 30 head on the wrong side of their water this morning." "I know," she said. He turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, not the dismissiveness of August, not the contempt she'd grown up watching him deploy toward anyone he'd decided wasn't worth his full attention. Something more uncertain than that, something that didn't have an easy name. "The gaps in the fence," he said. "Yes, the angle." "Yes." He looked back at the window for a moment. Then he said, "How exactly did you build it?" "Not why. Not who told you to. Not even a question. Quite more of a direction." The direction of a man turning himself towards something he didn't understand yet and deciding that he needed to. She looked at him. When Eleanor is well enough to travel, she said, come back without the storm, and I'll show you. He nodded, once slowly. Outside, the last of the blizzard moved south, and the morning light came through gray and clean, and the drift in the field stood enormous and still, and exactly where she had calculated it would be. The argument, as she had told Silas in August, had been settled. Not by her, not by Rhett. By November, Eleanor Rourke slept through most of the first day. She woke in the late afternoon with the particular disorientation of someone who has been unconscious long enough to lose the thread of time, and the first thing she said was Silas's name, not loudly. Just his name in the voice of a woman checking that something she cared about was still in the room. He was in the chair beside her, and he said, I'm here, and put his hand over hers. And Maren, who was across the room pretending to organize the kitchen shelf, kept her back turned and gave them that moment because it didn't belong to anyone else. Eleanor's hands were the ongoing concern. The color had come back to most of them, but the tips of two fingers on her right hand, the ring finger and the small finger, remained pale and waxy in a way that required watching. Maren had seen frostbite before. She'd seen it resolve and she'd seen it not resolve, and she knew the difference between the first 24 hours and what came after was largely about circulation and warmth and time, none of which she could rush. She rewrapped Eleanor's hands in the clean wool she kept in the medical tin and told her to keep them close to her body. I'm sorry for the trouble, Eleanor said, when she was awake enough to be embarrassed about it. You're not trouble, Maren said. You're a guest. We weren't invited. Neither was the storm. Maren set the medical tin aside. Eat something. Eleanor ate. She had the manner of a woman who had spent her life managing a difficult man and a large operation and had learned to move through the world at a particular pace, careful, watchful, not given to unnecessary words. Maren respected that without saying so. They understood each other across the room the way certain women understand each other, not through conversation, but through the recognition of familiar patterns of competence. Silas, by contrast, was harder to read. He sat beside his wife through the first day and into the evening, and he was not the man who had ridden up to her fence in August and laughed at her windbreak. That man had occupied the same body with the same face, but had carried himself differently, had the particular heaviness of certainty in his posture, the settled weight of someone who had never seriously doubted his own judgment. The man in her cabin now was lighter in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable. Like something had been removed, and the space it left was still tender. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was practical, asking about his horses, which Rhett had stabled properly the night before, asking about road conditions, asking about his cattle, which were still on the wrong side of their water entrance. That last one was the thing sitting on him the heaviest. He could see it. On the evening of the first day, after Eleanor had eaten and gone back to sleep, and Rhett had gone out to do the final barn check, Silas looked at Maren across the table and said, How many do you think I'll lose? She didn't pretend not to understand the question. Depends on how long it takes you to get back and how much the temperature drops overnight. She looked at him steadily. Your hands are the access problem, not the animals. If someone can get water to them from another entry point, they'll be all right through another day. There isn't another entry. Is there a window on the east face? He thought. A small one, nailed shut. If you can get a man to it in the morning with a bar, you can open it wide enough to pass water through by bucket. It's not efficient, but it covers the day until your main entrance is clear. He looked at her for a moment. You thought of that quickly. I've had blocked access before. She glanced toward the barn. February. Different problem, same logic. He was quiet for a while. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind had dropped to something more reasonable, still present, still cold, but no longer the consuming voice it had been the night before. My wall, he said. Then stopped. She waited. I put that wall in 11 years ago, he said. Same design my father used. Same design every rancher in this county uses. He looked at his hands on the table. I've watched 3 neighbors lose cattle to winter access issues in that time. Told myself they'd built their walls wrong. Too close. Wrong material. He stopped again. I never once thought the design itself was the problem. Maren didn't say anything immediately. She thought about what to say and chose honesty over kindness, not because kindness was wrong, but because Silas Rourke was not a man who would be served by softness right now. The design works in most winters, she said. That's why it persisted. Only fails in specific wind conditions, a northwest vector at sustained high velocity. Most years the wind is variable enough that the drift spreads instead of concentrating. She looked at him. This year it didn't. You knew that was possible. I thought it was possible. I wasn't certain. She paused. I'm still not certain my design will work every year. This was one winter. I need 3 bad ones before I'm certain. He looked at her with something new in his expression. She thought it was the honest answer that did it, the fact that she hadn't claimed more than she knew. Your father's girl, he said, and it wasn't dismissive the way she'd heard similar things said. It was something else, almost a recognition, my own person, she said. Quietly, but clearly, he accepted that with a nod. Rhett came back in from the barn and shook the cold off his coat and looked at the 2 of them sitting across the table without expression, which was one of his skills. He could read a room and adjust his entry to it without making the adjustment visible. He poured himself coffee and sat at the end of the table and said nothing, and the 3 of them sat in the warm kitchen while Eleanor slept in the next room, and the last of the blizzard spent itself harmlessly somewhere south of Briar Hollow. The next morning the roads were passable, barely, and Silas sent Rhett ahead to his ranch on horseback with the window bar instruction and a message for his man there. Eleanor was well enough to travel by afternoon, though Maren would have preferred another day. The 2 fingers were showing better color, which was the important thing, and Eleanor herself declared she was fine in the tone of a woman who means it and would tell you clearly if she didn't. Silas helped his wife to her horse with a care that was matter-of-fact and unperformed the care of a man who had been helping the same person for a long time and did it without thinking about it, which was its own kind of thing to witness. He stopped at the gate, turned back to Maren, who was standing in the yard. When the ground is clear, he said, I'll come back. I said you could. I'll bring my foreman. He paused. He does our winter builds. She nodded. He looked at the windbreak for a moment, or what was visible of it, the top of it above the snow line, the willow branches holding their angle against the white sky. Then he looked at her. I was wrong, he said. 3 words, flat and direct, without preface or qualification. She looked back at him. She didn't say I know, and she didn't say it's all right, because neither of those responses was what the moment needed. What she said was, the important thing is you understand why. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he tipped his hat and rode out through the gate with Eleanor beside him, and Maren watched them down the road until the distance absorbed them. She stood in the gate opening for a while after that, in the cold, in the sharp white quiet of a morning after a blizzard when the world looked remade. The drift in the field beyond the windbreak was enormous and still and beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they prove you right about something that cost you effort to understand. She went back to work. The days after a major storm were always about assessment and recovery, every system, identifying what the night had taken, deciding what could wait and what couldn't. She and Rhett moved through the property in a systematic way she'd developed over the years. Starting with water, moving to shelter, then to the herd, then to the structural elements. They didn't talk much during this phase. There wasn't a need to. The calf shelter had performed. That was the word she used when she noted it in her winter log performed. 6 of the younger animals had been in it through the worst of the storm, and all 6 were in better condition than she expected, which was not a word she used carelessly. The ventilation channel had done what she'd designed it to do. The floor was dry. The animals had warmth without the stale air that made spring harder. She stood in the shelter doorway and looked at the 6 calves and felt something that was not quite pride, something quieter than pride. The satisfaction of having thought a problem through completely and been proven right by something that couldn't be argued with. Well, she said to no one, then went back to the assessment. The conduit junction held, the anchor posts held. The one repaired willow section in the windbreak had held through the night with the emergency reinforcement, though it needed proper repair before the next storm. She put it on the list. The list had changed over the past year. Last November, the list had been survival. This November, the list was maintenance and improvement, and planning ahead for what could go wrong rather than reacting when it did. Those were different lists. The second one was harder. In some ways. It required imagining the future, committing to it, spending resources on things that weren't failing yet, but it was the list of a ranch that intended to last. The week after the blizzard passed in the particular way of post-storm weeks, a lot of physical work that required presence and effort but not much decision-making, which was almost restful in its own way. Maren moved through it steadily and let her mind settle. She noticed during that week that something had shifted in how she thought about Briar Hollow. She'd always thought of it as the thing she was responsible for. Her father's ranch, the thing he'd built and left, and that she'd refused to let go of. She was responsible for it, and she intended to keep it, and that was the frame she'd put around it. Somewhere in the past year, the frame had changed. It wasn't a responsibility she was honoring anymore. It was a place she was building. The distinction was subtle, but it was real. And it had something to do with the conduit junction and the windbreak angle and the calf shelter ventilation, and every problem she'd worked through out loud with someone who asked good questions and didn't need to be the one with the answers. She didn't examine this directly. She let it sit in the background where she could see it without having to name it, the way you let your eyes adjust to low light by not looking at the thing you're trying to see. Silas came back on a Thursday 3 weeks after the storm, as the territory was settling into the deep cold of late November. He brought his foreman, a lean, gray-haired man named Abner, who wore his skepticism openly and professionally, the skepticism of a man who had been building things for 40 years and was prepared to find fault as a baseline position. Maren walked them through the windbreak, fully the angle calculation, the gap ratio, the anchor depth, the placement relative to the barn. She explained it the way she'd explained it to Rhett months ago, without simplifying and without apology, the way you explain something when you're confident in your understanding of it. Abner asked questions, good ones, technical ones, the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the engineering rather than looking for holes. She answered all of them. Some she answered from the ratio table she'd built last winter, some from the observation log she kept, some from the physical reasoning that she couldn't always reduce to a number, but could describe clearly in terms of what she'd seen and why it worked. Silas didn't say much. He walked the barrier slowly, the way he'd walked it in August, but the quality of looking was entirely different. In August, he'd been looking for flaws to confirm what he'd already decided. Now he was looking at it the way you look at something you need to understand. He crouched at one point and looked at the gap between two willow sections at ground level, where the spacing was slightly wider than the sections above. She'd done that deliberately slightly wider gaps at the base to allow dense ground-level snow movement through, rather than building up and creating a solid base that would eventually block the gaps above. Wider at the bottom, he said. On purpose, he looked at the gap for another moment. Because snow at ground level is being driven, not falling. Yes, he straightened up, looked at her. She said nothing. He nodded once slowly. Then he looked at Abner. Abner had a piece of paper and a pencil out and was making notes. He looked up from the notes and looked at the windbreak and then at Maren. The gap ratio, he said. You worked that out yourself. Over last winter. Yes, you don't have an engineering background. I have a 40-year observation background, she said. It's this property's specific wind conditions. Someone else would need to do their own calculation for their own land. Abner looked at her for a moment with an expression that was still professional, but had lost some of its baseline skepticism. That's an honest answer, he said. I try to be accurate about what I know and what I've observed, and where the boundary between them is. He made another note. They came inside after that, and Maren made coffee, and the four of them, she, Rhett, Silas, Abner, sat at the kitchen table. And what followed was one of the strangest and most ordinary hours of Maren's life. They talked about winter construction, about the properties of willow versus board fencing in sustained cold, about drainage and footing, and what the county's standard practices got right and where they fell short. Abner disagreed with her on 2 points, clearly and specifically, and she engaged with both disagreements directly. And on one of them, she ended up conceding a partial point she hadn't considered. And on the other, she held her ground with the specific data she had, and at the end of it, Abner said, "All right," in the same tone Rhett had used in May about the footing problem. Silas was quiet through most of it, the way powerful men sometimes go quiet when they're in a room where the conversation is moved past, where they can lead it. He didn't seem uncomfortable with it. He seemed, and she watched this carefully, not trusting it at first, genuinely interested. As they were leaving, he stopped at the door. He had his hat in his hands and he was looking at it, and she had the sense that he was choosing his words, which was not something she'd ever associated with Silas Rourke. "There's a county meeting in February," he said. "Ranchers, planning for next winter. I go every year. I usually take up most of the air in the room." He looked up at her. "I'd like you to come." She looked at him. "To talk about this?" she said. "To talk about winter preparation, the windbreak, the drainage, the shelter design. All of it." He paused. "People will listen better if it comes with what happened here. The storm, Eleanor, the drift. People understand stories better than principles." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Voss and his revised numbers. She thought about Agnes Pruitt and her tin and her careful implication. She thought about a year of watching the territory's opinion of Briar Hollow shift by degrees, and about what it meant for Silas Rourke, who took up most of the air in a room, by his own admission, to be saying what he was saying. "I'll come," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, went through the door. Rhett was at the table with his coffee cup when she turned back to the room. He was looking at her with an expression she knew by now, the particular look he had when he was aware that something significant had just happened and was waiting to see how she received it. "Well," he said. "Don't make it into something," she said. "I'm not. You're looking at me like you're going to. I'm looking at you like someone who just watched Silas Rourke ask for your expertise at a county meeting." He set the cup down. Which is what happened. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was warm, and the afternoon light was the low gold of late November, and outside the windbreak stood at its angle, patient and unglamorous and exactly right. "He'll take the credit for it, eventually," she said. "Or someone will, and he'll let them. That's how these things go." Maybe. Rhett turned his cup on the table. Or maybe what he actually wants is for it to work. For people to stop losing cattle to preventable access problems. And he knows you're the one who figured that out. He paused. Give him the chance to be right before you decide he's wrong. She looked at him. "That's annoyingly fair. I have my moments." She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say that came out sideways from the conversation rather than through it. "I keep thinking about what this ranch looked like a year ago. When I showed up unconscious on your fence line. Before that even, the fall. After my father died, she was quiet for a moment, organizing what she wanted to say, and finding it harder than most things she said because it required a kind of looking inward she wasn't practiced at. I had a plan: survive the winter, make the repairs, keep the herd alive, get to spring." She looked up. "That was the whole plan, get to spring, and now? Now the plan goes out further." She said it simply. "I think about next winter and the one after. I think about what this place could be in 10 years if the drainage is right and the infrastructure holds." She paused. "I didn't used to think that far." He was looking at her steadily. "What changed?" She almost said something imprecise. Almost said something that deflected. Old habit. Instead she said, "You came back in April." He held her gaze. You came back with lumber and a contract and a working mare and a pile of oats, she said. And you didn't do it to rescue me. You did it because you owed a debt that you couldn't settle with money, and because this place needed work, and you could do the work. She looked at him clearly. But it changed the horizon. Having someone here who was thinking about the same problems changed how far forward I could see. Rhett was quiet for long enough that the stove made two distinct sounds, and the light in the kitchen shifted slightly. The room I've been sleeping in, he said finally. The south barn room. What about it? It's cold in a way that's becoming genuinely problematic. He said it with the particular straight face of someone who was not quite joking. I've been calculating heat loss through the south wall, and it's not an acceptable situation. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. I know you're serious. That's what concerns me. There's a solution, I expect there is. I could build a room on the eastern side of the cabin, he said. Proper insulation, connected to the main structure's heating system. It would add value to the property and solve the problematic south barn situation. He paused. The timing is good. The ground hasn't frozen deep enough yet to make the foundation work impossible. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a significant amount of work, she said. I'm aware. It would take you through to spring, probably. Probably. And after spring, he met her eyes. I'd rather build it as your husband than as your hired hand. The kitchen was very quiet. She'd known this was coming, or she'd known something was coming that looked like this for months. She'd known it and not known it in the way you don't know things you're not ready to look at directly. And now it was out in the room, and she was looking at it, and it was not frightening in the way she'd always assumed commitment would be after watching her father's loneliness and her own careful solitude. It was just there, real and plain and waiting. She thought about what she was. She was a woman who talked to cattle in January and kept a ratio table for windbreak gaps and had cracked knuckles from November through March every year. She was not easy to live with, and she knew it. She had opinions she defended past the point of comfort, and she didn't apologize for her methods. And she needed solitude the way some people need water, and she was not, by any measure, a simple proposition. She thought about what he was. He was a man who had ridden back in April with a wagon of lumber and fair terms, and hadn't once tried to make himself necessary by making her feel insufficient. He'd learned the ranch by watching her, and asked questions that made her answers better, and fixed things she pointed at, and fixed some things she hadn't pointed at, and let her be wrong without making her pay for it, and had made coffee in the middle of a blizzard at 4 a.m. when neither of them said a word about it. She thought about 2 coats on the hooks by the door, about the second cup of coffee that she poured now without thinking about it, about the way the cabin had been quiet before and was quiet differently now, not empty quiet, but the quiet of a space that had 2 people in it who didn't need to fill every moment with sound. She said, "Square the foundation first." He looked at her. "Before anything else," she said, "the foundation has to be square. I won't have a crooked room on this house." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was fully in that territory, and it was, she thought, the most unguarded expression she'd seen on him, not the controlled competence or the careful attention or the level-eyed steadiness, but something underneath all of that. Something that had been waiting for an answer. "Square foundation," he said. "I can do that." "I know you can," she said. "That's why I said it." They were married in December, quietly, at the county office in Harlan, with the paperwork done in a manner that was efficient and legal, and attended by exactly 3 people, Silas and Eleanor Rourke, who had been asked because it seemed right and because Eleanor cried in a way that was dignified and genuine and entirely without warning, and Tom Belair, who had come with his hat in his hands and said almost nothing, and shook Rhett's hand and nodded at Maren in a way that communicated something she chose to accept as warmth. There was no ceremony beyond the legal requirement. She hadn't wanted one, and he hadn't suggested one, which was one of many indications that they were suited. Eleanor pulled Maren aside before they left the county building. She was wearing her good coat, and her hands were fully healed. The 2 fingers had recovered entirely. which Maren had been more relieved about than she'd let show, and she held Maren by the arm in the particular grip of an older woman with something important to deliver. "I want to tell you something," Eleanor said. "All right." "Silas is not an easy man. I have known this for 31 years. She said it with the particular affectionate resignation of someone who has made peace with a complicated truth. But he is capable of being right when he's been sufficiently wrong. She looked at Maren directly. "What you did last month, taking us in without asking for an apology, without pointing at what you'd built and saying, 'We told you that cost you something.'" "I saw it cost you." Maren started to say something. "Let me finish." Eleanor held her arm more firmly. "He will advocate for your work at that February meeting without fully crediting you for it, because that is the way he is, and you probably already know that." She paused. "But the families who hear about the windbreak and the drainage and the calf shelter will know it came from somewhere. They'll ask, and when they ask, my husband will tell the truth. He does tell the truth eventually." She released Maren's arm. "I wanted you to know that, because you deserve more than eventually, but sometimes eventually is what there is." Maren looked at Eleanor Rourke and thought about what it took to know someone that clearly and stay, and about what staying meant when it wasn't resignation but choice. "Thank you," she said. Eleanor nodded and pulled her coat closed and went to find her husband. The foundation for the new room went in before the ground froze completely. Rhett dug it in 3 days with help from Tom Bellaire's eldest son, who worked for wages and didn't talk much and did what he was shown, which were qualifications that suited the job. Maren checked the square twice, once when the string lines were up and once when the first stone course was set, and both times it was true. "Told you," Rhett said when she came back from the second check. "I wasn't doubting you. I was verifying. Those are the same thing." "They absolutely are not." She put the square back in the toolbox. "Doubt is a disposition. Verification is a practice." "I would verify my own measurements." He looked at her with that expression. "The one underneath the controlled ones. That's an important distinction to you." "It's an important distinction in general." She picked up the toolbox. "People who don't verify because they trust themselves completely are the people who build solid wind walls and then act surprised when the drift blocks the barn." He didn't say anything to that, but he was smiling in the way he smiled when he didn't want to be obviously smiling, which was a small movement at the corner of his mouth and a specific quality in his eyes, and she'd gotten good at reading it. The room went up through December and was framed by the end of the month. Not finished finishing would take January and probably part of February, and there were details she had opinions about that would require more of the measured arguments they were both, by now, quite practiced at, but framed and roofed and part of the house's structure rather than an addition to it. She stood in the framed space one evening with a lantern and looked at the walls and the window opening that faced east and felt the cold air moving through it and thought about how it would feel when it was insulated and warm and occupied. She thought about the south barn room, which Rhett had slept in for 8 months. The thin walls, the inadequate heat, the way he'd never once complained about it had just worked around it with the practicality of someone accustomed to difficult conditions. She'd known it wasn't adequate. She'd let it be inadequate because making it better would have meant a conversation she wasn't ready for. She was ready now. The February meeting came, and Maren went, and it was exactly what Silas had promised a room full of ranchers and their foremen, mostly men of a certain age and certainty. The kind of meeting where the same voices usually said the same things, and the agreement was reached before anyone sat down. She sat near the back with Rhett and didn't volunteer anything until Silas, from the front of the room, said her name. He didn't ask her to stand. He told the room that Briar Hollow had run a winter preparation experiment in the November storm and that the results were worth examining, and then he looked at her and said, "Maren, tell them what you built and why." She stood. She talked for 20 minutes. She showed the gap ratio table she'd brought, drawn out large enough to read. She described the angle calculation and the placement logic and the drift deposit they'd measured after the storm. She talked about the calf shelter ventilation and the conduit junction design and what they'd held through conditions that had compromised other properties in the area. She talked about watching cattle in February and learning airflow from where they stood. She talked about the problem with solid walls, which caused a difficult silence in the room, since most of the men present had solid walls, including 2 who had lost cattle access in the November storm but had attributed it to unusual conditions rather than design failure. She did not say "I told you so." She didn't need to. The room was full of men doing their own math, and math doesn't require an editorial. Abner Silas's foreman vouched for the engineering reasoning. Tom Belair said the footing repair work at Briar Hollow was the best he'd seen in the county. A rancher named Gus Halverson from the Northwest County, who had lost 11 head to an access problem in October and had come to the meeting angry about it, asked her 3 questions in succession that were sharper and more specific than anything else asked in the room, and she answered all 3. And at the end of it, Halverson looked at her and said, "You should have been invited to these meetings 10 years ago." She didn't say she hadn't been born 10 years ago. She said, "I'm here now." The room shifted after that. Not dramatically, not the way rooms shift in stories, where everyone suddenly sees the truth and the atmosphere transforms. More like the way a field shifts in spring, in the specific slow way that change actually works. People asked questions, practical ones. People who wouldn't have looked at her directly in August were writing things down. After the meeting, Silas found her at the door. "Well?" he said. "It went well," she said. "You were better than I expected." He said it with the honest clumsiness of a man who was trying to offer a genuine compliment and hadn't fully practiced the genre. "I expected you to be good. You were better than that." She looked at him. "I know what I'm talking about." "I know that now," he paused. "I knew it when you told me to come back without the storm. I didn't know it in August." He held her gaze. "August was my mistake. I'm telling you that clearly because you deserve to hear it clearly and not have me expect you to infer it." She thought about what Eleanor had said. "He tells the truth, eventually." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Then Eleanor wants to have you both to dinner. When the roads permit, we'd like that." He went to find his foreman, and Maren watched him cross the room, still the largest presence in it, still the man who took up the air, but carrying it differently than he had before, with something less fortified in it, and she thought about what it cost a man like that to be wrong in a way that endangered his wife. She thought about what it required to turn that cost into something useful rather than something defended. She didn't forgive him the August laughter, because forgiving implied that she'd been holding it, and she'd let it go before the November storm had finished. But she understood him better now, and understanding is its own kind of thing, distinct from forgiveness and sometimes worth more. Rhett was waiting at the door with both their coats, which he held out to her with the economy of gesture she'd come to associate with everything he did. She put her coat on, and they went out into the February cold together, and the street was quiet and white, and the sky was the clear, hard blue of a Montana winter day when the storms are resting. "Halverson's going to want your help with his windbreak in the spring," Rhett said. "I know. Are you going to?" She thought about the list. The list that went further forward than it used to. "Yes, if he asks properly." She pulled her collar up. "What he builds on his land is his business. What I share with him is mine." "That's fair. I'm consistently fair." "You're consistently something," he said, and she looked at him sidelong, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing again. They rode back to Briar Hollow in the late afternoon, and the light was already going by the time they came through the gate, which was the quality of light she'd grown up with and still found beautiful in its particular finality, the way Montana February evenings didn't fade so much as close, like a hand settling over a lamp. The windbreak stood at its angle against the western sky. The barn roof held its load evenly. The new room addition on the east side of the cabin rose from its square foundation, framed and real. She looked at it as they came through the gate, the way she'd been looking at it since December, still slightly surprised that it was there, still adjusting to the shape of the cabin, being different from the shape she'd grown up with. Better, she thought. Not because it was new, because it was right. They stabled the horses and came inside, and she built the stove up, and Rhett hung his coat on the hook beside hers. And she put water on and started supper with the particular competence of someone who knows the space they're working in and has stopped needing to think about where everything is. Later, when the food was done and the table was set and the cabin was warm with the smell of it, she poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she'd kept going since afternoon and carried them both to the table and set them down, one at her place and one across from her, which was where the second cup had been going for months now. Not since the wedding, not since April even, but since November of the previous year when she'd come back from a blizzard and found the blanket folded on her floor and sat in her father's chair and let the night pass. The second cup had been going there since before she'd named what it meant. Since before there was a word for it, because some things exist before you find the language for them, and the language doesn't make them more true. Rhett came to the table and sat across from her and looked at his cup, and then at her, and she looked back at him without saying anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the 2 cups on the table didn't already say more cleanly. Outside, a wind was moving across Briar Hollow, not a storm. Not tonight. Just the ordinary Montana wind that kept coming and kept finding this place and kept, since last November, being met by an angled barrier of willow branches that understood it well enough to use it rather than fight it. The snow it carried deposited out in the field, where it was harmless and would be useful come spring when it melted into the ground. The barn entrance was clear. The water was running. 2 cups sat on the table. Maren picked hers up and drank it, and looked across at the man who had come back when he didn't have to, who had squared the foundation first, who had learned the shape of her reach and adjusted to it without making her ask. She thought about her father's words, "Listen, when the wind shifts east, something out there needs help." And she thought about a November night when she'd gone out in the dark because a horse wouldn't leave something it was standing beside. And about everything that had followed from that, the chain of decisions she'd made, not because they were easy, but because they were right. The choice to haul a stranger off a fence line, the choice to let him stay, the choice to let him come back. She thought about what survival had looked like a year ago get to spring, just get to spring, and what it looked like now, which was longer and more complicated, required sharing more of herself than she'd ever planned to share. She thought about the fact that needing nobody had not been strength. It had been the specific armor of someone who had been hurt enough to call isolation safety. And she thought about the particular morning she'd come downstairs and heard someone already working in the barn, and the way the meadowlark had been singing into an empty yard that was not, for the first time in months, empty at all. She put her cup down. Rhett was looking at her in the way he looked at things he was seeing clearly. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything's fine." He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his own cup and drank it and looked at the table and then at the window where the dark had fully settled, and they sat together in the kitchen of the house her father had built, and that she was building differently. In the warm, ordinary silence of people who had work tomorrow and knew where everything was and had stopped needing to fill the quiet with sound. The wind moved through the willows, the water ran, Briar Hollow held.